If the AZ-104 feels harder than it should, there's a good chance the problem is not the exam. It's the way you're actually studying for it. Look, Microsoft Certified Trainer here, and I see this all the time. Someone has gone through the learning paths, right? They've watched a load of videos, great. Even done some of those practice questions, perfect. And on paper, it looks like they've done everything right. When they get into the actual exam, the questions feel more difficult than expected. The options feel too similar. And suddenly, all that confidence totally disappeared. And that's because the AZ-104 doesn't really reward passive study. It rewards understanding. It rewards context. It rewards knowing why one choice makes sense over another in a real Azure environment. So in this video, I want to show you what people usually get wrong when they prepare for the AZ-104 and what you should do, what you should be doing instead if you actually want to pass it in a way that also makes you better in the real world. The reason AZ-104 catches so many people out is that it sits in an awkward place, right? It's not the fundamental exam, so you can't just rely on sort of broad product awareness and basic definitions. But it's also not purely an architect exam where everything is highly conceptual. It lives in that sort of middle ground where you need to know enough detail to understand how Azure behaves operationally, while also being able to reason through real scenarios. That's what makes it uncomfortable for a lot of people. You can read about RBAC, subscriptions, VNets, NSGs, storage accounts, backup, monitoring and compute all you want. You can recognize all those items, right? You can feel like you know the platform, but then the exam asks you something slightly more situational. Suddenly you realize the recognition is not the same thing as understanding. A simple example that would be networking, right? A lot of people can tell you what VNet peering is. They've heard of it, probably seen it in the portal. Maybe they even know the basic definition, right? But if you ask them to reason through a scenario where traffic needs to move between virtual networks, there are NSGs involved. Maybe DNS resolution is relevant. And there's a requirement around least privilege or cost efficiency. That's where weaker preparation actually starts to show. The gap between, I've seen this before and I know how to use it properly, is the entire AZ-104 problem. This is the number one issue, and it sits underneath almost every other mistake. Okay, most people study AZ-104 like it's a theory exam. They work through the content, might take some notes, maybe even highlight important terms and focus on trying to remember features, service names and definitions. And the reason they do that is because it feels productive. You finish your video, tick off a module, move to the next topic, right? And it gives you that sense that you're actually progressing. The problem is that Azure doesn't really work like that in practice, right? And the exam doesn't either. Someone might spend an hour reading about storage redundancy options and come away feeling like they've understood storage accounts. But then the exam gives them a scenario where the business needs, the durability in a specific region. Maybe it has a secondary region requirement, right? And perhaps wants to optimize cost. And suddenly they're not just like recalling definitions anymore, right? They're actually making design and operational decisions. If all you've done is memorize the words, that question becomes much, much harder than it should be. This is why people often say things like, I knew the topic, but the questions threw me. In reality, we didn't know the topic deeply enough, right? They knew the surface of the topic. That's the first thing that has to change, right? You can't prepare for AZ-104 by trying to collect information. You have to learn how Azure behaves. One of the most dangerous things in AZ-104 preparation is false confidence. Right? You watch a clean, well-structured explanation of a topic like Microsoft Entra ID, guest access, self-service password reset, or Azure policy, and because the explanation is clear, right? You start to feel like the topic is clear in your own head. That is a trap. Okay? Understanding someone else's explanation is not the same as being able to apply that knowledge. A real good sort of real-life scenario here is role-based access control. Right, a lot of people can tell you that the Azure RBAC is used to manage access to Azure resources. Fine, right? They know the phrase, but when you put them into a scenario where a team needs just enough access to manage virtual machines in one resource group, but then sort of no networking and not across a subscription, suddenly they're not being asked what is RBAC, right? They're actually being asked to think like an administrator. Which scope makes sense? Which role is too broad? What would actually reduce risk while still allowing the work to be done? That's the level AZ-104 pushes you toward. So if your preparation makes you feel comfortable because the content is familiar, that doesn't necessarily mean you're ready. It may just mean you're good at recognizing Microsoft terminology. That's not me being harsh either, right? That's just the truth of how this exam works. This is the point where most people, know what they should do, right? But they still don't do enough of it. They know they should get hands-on. They know labs are useful, but they still leave it too late. Or they treat it like something to do once, the real study is finished. That's backwards. The hands-on work is the real study. If you create a virtual network, deploy a VM into it, apply an NSG, and then test what actually works and what actually doesn't, you learn far more than you do by just reading the definitions. If you build a storage account, create a file share, apply security settings, then generate access signatures as well, then break your own access accidentally, right? That teaches you something much more durable than a slide ever will. If you configure monitoring, those alerts, backup a recovery vault, you actually see that sort of workflow, what it feels like. You start to understand the services in the way the exam expects you to. Here's a very realistic example I'm going to give you now, okay? Someone studying for the AZ-104 reads about NSGs and thinks, got it. Inbound and outbound rules, priorities, allow and deny. Then they do a lab where a VM can't be reached, and they spend 20 minutes figuring out whether the problem is the NSG, the subnet association, the OS firewall, or the public IP. That 20 minutes of confusion teaches them more than 40 pages of notes ever will. That's the difference between abstract knowledge and operational understanding. And AZ-104 is much more on the side of operational understanding than people actually realise. One of the things that makes this exam feel difficult is that many of the answers can look technically possible in your sort of preparation, and if it's shallow enough. That's why what does this service do is the wrong question to build your study around. The far better question is, why would I choose this over alternatives? This matters across the whole exam, right? It matters when you compare storage options. It matters when you choose between identity and governance controls. It matters when you look at backup versus resiliency patterns. It matters when you're deciding how to manage access, where to apply a lock or a policy, or how to secure data. Let's get another example. Let's take backups, right? That's the example. Someone can read a module and understand that Azure backups exist. Great. But then a scenario asks how to protect a virtual machine, or how to restore under certain constraints, or even what service best meets the requirement. And now the exam is really asking, do you understand the practical purposes of the service and where it fits? The same thing happens with governance. Plenty of people can explain what tags are, right? It doesn't mean they're prepared for a scenario about controlling cost visibility, organising resources, enforcing organisational standards, or even understanding when Azure policy is the correct control versus when role-based access or RBAC or even locks make more sense. That is a level of thinking you need, right? You stop studying each feature in isolation, start understanding how the platform fits together. A lot of people either misuse practice assessments or rely on them too heavily. The worst version of this is if people trying to memorize answers. Doesn't work, right? And even when it feels like it's working, usually creates sort of fragile confidence that falls apart in the exam. The right way to use practice questions is to treat them like a mirror. They should expose how you're thinking. If you answer a question incorrectly, the useful part is not the answer key. The useful part is working out why the wrong answer felt attractive in the first place. Maybe you choose the broadest permission because it sounded easiest. That tells you something about how you're thinking about access control. Maybe you picked a storage option because the name sounded familiar, not because it matched the requirement, right? That tells you your understanding is still too word-based and not scenario-based. Maybe you got a networking question wrong because you know the services individually, right? But still you can't see how they interact with each other. That tells you you're spending too much time building and troubleshooting, not just revising. That's how to practice questions, right? And that's how they become valuable. This should show you where your reasoning is still weak. This is probably the most important mindset shift of all. Right? AZ-104 is not asking whether you can study Azure. Right? It's asking whether you can think like someone responsible for implementing, managing, securing and monitoring Azure resources. That means thinking in terms of control, risk, scope, simplicity, security and operational outcomes. So when you read a question, right, instead of asking, what did that module say? You need to start asking, what would make sense in a real Azure environment? Okay, here's another simple scenario. Imagine you're asked about giving a team access to manage a workload. If your instinct is to just pick the most powerful role because it's obviously going to let them do the work, that's not really thinking like an administrator, right? An administrator thinks about scope, think least privilege and operational practicality. The answer is not just what works. The answer is what works safely and appropriately. That same mindset applies across the whole exam. Azure admins don't just know features, they apply judgment. That's exactly what the exam is measuring more than people realise. If I were looking at someone's AZ-104 preparation and trying to work out whether they were on the right track, I wouldn't care how many videos they watched or how many notes they took. I'd care about whether they can explain and apply the platform. Can they create users, groups and role assignments, and then explain why they chose that given scope? Can they deploy and secure storage in a way that makes sense for the scenario? Can they build networking, connect things and troubleshoot why traffic isn't flowing? Can they reason through compute, monitoring, backup and governance choices based on what the business is actually asking for? That's what readiness looks like. Not perfect memory, right? Not a stack of completed modules. Not even recognizing every screenshot from the portal. Readiness is being able to understand the platform well enough that exam questions feel logical, even when they're difficult. That's the standard you want to aim for. Look, if you take one thing away from this video, it should be this. Most people don't struggle with the AZ-104 Azure Administrator exam because the exam is unfair. They struggle because their study method is too passive, too shallow, and too detached from how Azure is actually used. If you study like it's a theory exam, right, you'll feel busy and unprepared. If you study like an Azure administrator would work, building, testing, breaking and fixing and reasoning, the whole thing starts to make much more sense. That's the difference between hoping you'll pass and actually being ready. In the next video, I'm going to do why this actual AZ-104 exam I don't feel it's enough anymore. And that's where I'm going to talk about what this certification does give you, what it doesn't give you, and why passing it is only one part of becoming genuinely strong in Azure, right? Look, I appreciate everyone's support. I am trying to build my YouTube channel from scratch again. It's been a lot already harder than I thought in the first month, you know. I do appreciate everyone's support, but if you are watching this video and you like it and you like my other content, please do me a favour and smash that subscribe button, right? The more subscribers I have, the more reach I can have, right? And the more help I can give people out there. Don't forget to like and drop me a comment with your thoughts on this video or any other of my videos as well. And if you hit that notify button, that'll also tell you when my videos are coming out. So, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.